Terra Invicta is an early access grand strategy game that combines three incredibly detailed simulations in one. It's a macro geopolitical simulator of Earth, where somewhat secretive and highly unique factions are vying for control. Here you can see me setting up a game in Terra Invicta. The factions range from the resistance, who are fighting against the aliens, right the way to the servants, who, you guessed it, are their toadies, and everywhere in between. It also has a detailed physics-driven deep space combat system with a whole load of units, as you can see. And finally, of course, it's about human industrialization and expansion into space. And it does a pretty good job at simulating the wider solar system, although that's largely held for what I call Phase 2 of Terra Invicta. Phase 1, as you can see on screen, is about establishing your presence on Earth. Again, you're not playing as a nation state, but rather as a faction. And your faction has its own unique interests and dealings with the other factions, the Initiative, the Academy, and everyone else in between. The gameplay itself, the geopolitical side of things, is largely driven by your council. As you can see here, you can recruit from a list of councillors. Each one has their own unique skill set. This directly impacts how well they do certain diplomatic or operative or combat-driven tasks in the game. And of course, they contribute to your science and the generation of those other 4x yields like money and influence. Your councillors are primarily used to grab control of control points. These sit within nation states, and once you gain control of them, you'll get access to the resources that it produces. Some resources are fairly straightforward, like I say, money, influence. Others, though, include your capacity to get into space, that boost resource, that of course you'll tend to find in those more wealthy nations, or it may be better for you to settle near the equator, because real-world physics are a deep part of this simulation as well. Don't forget that. And as you can see on screen, here's Mexico as one example. The simulation within the nation states is incredibly detailed as well. GDP is one of the main drivers, but we also have indicators for wealth disparity, for national policies that you can set, directly influencing the yields and resources that come out of these nation states, but also how they grow throughout your game, giving each game a unique feel. And while it's an incredibly accurate, detailed simulation of Earth, there's also some maneuverability between playthrough sessions, thanks to the factions, but also thanks to how the simulation plays out in real time. Combat in Terra Invicta, like many things inside of this game, has a few different layers to it. On-Earth combat is fairly straightforward, like Hearts of Iron oversimplified almost. Territorial combat between armies based on their units, their technological development, and how strong they are. In space, though, you'll see it's a little bit different. There are a whole load of mechanics here at play. It is a complicated simulation. You can play around with it in the skirmish mode if you're not playing a campaign. That's what I'm doing here, to take a look at all of the different options inside of battle, from your posturing to the ships that you choose to bring. Terra Invicta delivers a wonderfully detailed simulation for combat, and if you don't feel like playing it out, you can just put it into auto mode and let it play through. If you want to jump into the detail, though, be prepared to invest quite a bit of time. From finely tuning the movements of your ships using these colorful nodes here to steer them across the map, to choosing when to use your shields, barriers, deflectors, weapons. It's got everything inside of it, and this is incredibly detailed. It's not necessarily a good or bad system, in my opinion. It's somewhat clunky and certainly not intuitive. Like I say, you'll need to spend a little bit of time to really perfect it here, I think. And combat, like I said in the introduction, is but one part of three broader simulations that this game, Terra Invicta, manages to try and pull together into one, I would argue, not fully cohesive piece. The next element is, of course, the geopolitics involved in the game. Here it's everything from, like I mentioned earlier, grabbing control points, but also other things at play. The research system, as you can see here, is a great example. You have your own private projects that you can research, like I'm selecting through here, but also the global research. This screen is really what drives the big change in development. Here you choose how much of your science to contribute to different global research tasks, and once these tasks are completed, you can then delve into the detail as your own private faction and research new technologies and equipment projects for you to use. And you'll use these in real time. As you can see, the game plays out with a pause and play function, like a real-time strategy game would. However, once every 1 to 2 weeks, it'll pause to allow you to send your counselors out to do those interactions, whether they're trying to gain control of a state like Mexico and its control points, or some of those more nefarious deeds, operations like coups d'etats, sabotaging enemies, potentially overthrowing a government, or increasing stability to try and hold what you have. There are loads of different ways that you can interact with the Earth map, and of course each country is incredibly well simulated, providing not just an accurate simulation of its GDP, but also things like resources and that vital boost mechanic, that resource that we need to take ourselves from being on Earth and through into phase 2 of the game, which, as I alluded to in the introduction, is more about expansion and industrialization of space. Here we shift from an earthly focus and zoom out, looking at not only that fleet combat that we talked about a little bit earlier, but also about how we now manage an emerging alien threat. The alien threat does first come into your radar very early on. They crash land on Earth and there are some research projects that you can deal with. However, really you don't tend to deal with them until you're out here, out in space, whether you're fighting against them with your wonderful battleships, or instead taking a more toady approach, combining yourself with them, finding allies on Earth to help the aliens survive and thrive rather than resisting them. Speaking of the aliens, I do find that their play is a little bit off at times. At least, they don't quite gel with the overall experience. In the early game, they're relatively absent. And then in the later game, where you're moving between trying to colonize space and reach out and grab all of the resources and fight with them directly, potentially, and then you're flashed back to Earth dealing with the coup d'etat in Morocco, it can feel a little bit disjointed. These layers, while wonderfully detailed and complex simulations of every element from Earth to the alien invasions and everything in between, can sometimes be a little bit muddied. They don't necessarily gel perfectly with one another. I think also, if it hasn't been obvious to you already, the time investment needed to not only master Terra Invicta, but even just start to learn it and feel comfortable with it is likely not in the single-digit hours. A game, in my experience, takes around 30 to 50, 60 hours, depending on, of course, how quickly you're playing and how long you're spending making these decisions. And I think you may need 1 or 2 of them to actually start to feel like you have a good grasp across all of the different complexities that Terra Invicta offers. And while its user interface and somewhat limited tutorials do a reasonable job at upfronting the information that you need, the important events, the things that you should maybe be aware of. Hey, there's a territory over here that you might want to control. It's all fine and good, but at the end of the day, there are still some accessibility problems here. It is an overwhelming simulation, and with that comes an overwhelming amount of complexity. Moreover, the UI is, as you can see, bogged down in a lot of detail, and you would expect that, of course, of a detailed simulation, but it can make the user experience clunky at times. You may find that you make mistakes or simply miss important details as they're bogged down in the rest of the simulation. However, to conclude, Terra Invicta is a fantastic early access grand strategy indie game, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it develops through its early access period. It'll be quite telling to see how the game changes and morphs and how long it stays here. I think the experience overall is pretty smooth for what it's trying to accomplish, although your time investment in it will be steep. The UI and tutorials, while they make admirable attempts to present what's right, can make it a game that's difficult to recommend to someone looking for a quick experience. Personally, Terra Invicta will be staying in my Steam library, and I'm looking forward to seeing its progression.